Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Welcome back to the deep dive. And we have a very specific mission for you today.
We really do.
Yeah. We are serving as your ultimate study guide for Chapter 5 of We the People. Essentials. That's the 15th edition.
The big chapter on civil rights.
Exactly. So if you're, a college student encountering U.S. government for the very first time, you are in the perfect place. We're going to break down the central concepts exactly in the order they appear in the text.
Right, so you'll be perfectly prepped.
Okay, so the text starts with this incredibly intense hook. It's August 2005, and a man named Desmond Meade is standing by a railroad track in Florida.
Yeah.
And he is actually contemplating suicide. He's homeless, he's unemployed, and because of a previous felony conviction, he has been entirely stripped of his right to vote.
Right. Legally, he's been rendered totally voiceless.
Right. And what's wild is this wasn't just some modern, administrative glitch.
No, not at all. Meade couldn't vote because of a ban written into the Florida Constitution all the way back in 1868.
Wow, 1868.
Yeah. It was a post-Civil War measure specifically designed to permanently disenfranchise people with felony records.
So Meade obviously doesn't end his life that day. He steps away from the tracks, and he initiates one of the most remarkable turnarounds in modern political history.
It's amazing. He goes to community college.
Yeah, gets a law degree. He becomes president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And he builds this huge grassroots movement, gathering, I think it was like 750,000 signatures.
Exactly. To get Amendment 4 on the 2018 Florida ballot.
Right. And that was a direct challenge to that 1868 constitutional ban.
And it worked. The amendment passed with over 64% of the vote, restoring voting rights to hundreds of thousands of previously incarcerated people.
He even framed his new voter registration card. It's this incredible victory. But, and the text points this out, the narrative takes a really sharp turn here.
It does.
Because in 2019, Florida enacted a new law. They basically said, okay, you can vote, but you have to pay all outstanding court fees and fines first.
Which completely undercut the amendment. For hundreds of thousands of people, it created this massive financial hurdle they just couldn't clear.
So his organization had to pivot.
Right.
They had to start a multi-million-dollar fund just to help people pay those fines.
Right. And Meade finally got his own rights restored through a separate clemency process in 2021.
So we were bringing this up right at the start because it perfectly illustrates the whole heartbeat of this chapter. Civil rights are almost never just handed down voluntarily.
Never. They are fought for, won, and then, constantly defended. Right.
So to understand that fight, we have to define what we're actually fighting for. And the text draws this really sharp line between civil liberties and civil rights.
Which people confuse all the time.
All the time. So you listening, to remember this for a test, I want you to use this analogy. Think of civil liberties as a yellow do not cross police tape.
Okay, I like that.
They are negative protections. They literally just tell the government what it cannot do to you. No unreasonable searches. The government just has to stay away.
Right.
But civil rights. Think of civil rights as the government acting as your personal bodyguard.
And a bodyguard is totally different from police tape. A bodyguard is active, right? It's interventionist.
Right. It costs money.
Exactly. A civil liberty is cheap. The state just leaves you alone. But a civil right is a positive obligation. The government must take action, spend resources, and actively intervene to guarantee your equal citizenship.
Which means it has to protect you from discrimination by others.
Right. And historically, the police tape, the civil liberties, those were baked right into the original Bill of Rights. But the bodyguard, civil rights evolved over time.
Right, because historically discriminated groups had to organize and demand them.
Which brings us to how they actually do that. The textbook introduces this concept of social movements.
Okay, define that for us.
It's essentially a sustained campaign brought by disadvantaged populations using collective action. Because, one marginalized person asking for a law is super easy to ignore.
Yeah, obviously.
But thousands of people organizing, that creates friction the system cannot ignore.
And the text categorizes these strategies into two main buckets, right? The outside strategy and the inside strategy.
Exactly.
And there's this striking photo in the text for the outside strategy. It shows Native American activists protesting the Dakota pipeline. They're marching down a dirt road, and one leader is wearing this traditional feathered war bonnet. It's all about shifting public opinion.
Because that's step one. Disadvantaged groups don't usually have the millions of dollars or the insider connections to lobby Congress.
Right. Formal political institutions have crazy high barriers to entry.
Exactly. But the public arena, marching in the street, that has a very low barrier to entry.
So that's the outside strategy. But eventually you have to target the formal institutions through the inside strategy.
Right. You have to change the actual law.
And the textbook has 3 specific photos that visualize this. First, to influence the president, we see LBJ in the Oval Office talking with MLK and Whitney Young.
Direct presidential influence.
Right. Then, to influence Congress, there's this 1960s black and white photo of marchers moving right down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol.
Pressuring the lawmakers.
Yep. And finally, to influence the courts, we see a photo of James Obergefell standing in front of the Supreme Court, surrounded by journalists.
So you're watching the movement go from shifting culture on the outside to rewriting policy on the inside.
But wait, I have to push back on this for a second.
Sure.
If the ultimate goal is always, passing a law or getting a court ruling, why spend all that time on the outside protests? Why not just pool whatever money you have and hire a good lobbyist?
Well, because politicians fundamentally want to maintain the status quo. The text actually cites research on this. It shows that the protests in the 1960s directly influenced voter attitudes.
Oh, I see.
Right. The outside protests make the average voter care. And once the voters care, the politicians suddenly feel vulnerable. It literally forced the hands of the president and Congress.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's look at how that inside strategy works in the judicial branch. Because the constitutional engine for all of this is the 14th Amendment.
Specifically, the Equal Protection Clause, which was adopted in 1868.
Right. And a crucial concept in the textbook here is the burden of proof. Basically, who has to prove a law is unfair?
This is huge. The courts use a test called strict scrutiny, and under strict scrutiny, the burden of proof shifts entirely onto the government.
Wait, really? So the citizen doesn't have to prove the law is unconstitutional?
Nope. The Supreme Court assumes the law is unconstitutional, and the government has to prove that their discriminatory law is an absolute compelling necessity.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an incredibly high bar.
But the court didn't always use strict scrutiny, right? I mean, the text walks us through the 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson.
Oh, yeah. That's a dark part of the history.
Where the Supreme Court actually upheld Jim Crow laws under the separate but equal doctrine.
Right. It took decades to dismantle that. But finally, in 1954, you get the monumental Brown v. Board of Education decision.
The famous one.
Exactly. The court ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that is what officially triggered the use of strict scrutiny for racial discrimination.
Okay, but here's my question. If the Supreme Court outlawed segregation in 1954, why are the 1960s known as the absolute peak of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Shouldn't the problem have been solved by Brown v. Board?
You would think so, but the text provides crucial context here. Court decisions are not self-enforcing.
They don't have their own army.
Exactly. This leads to a massive distinction you need to know for the exam. De jure segregation versus de facto segregation.
Okay, break those down.
De jure segregation is legally enforced segregation, like a law saying white and colored water fountains. Brown v. Board struck that down.
Right, the legal mandate was gone.
But de facto segregation, which is actual practical segregation based on housing or economics, that continued. 10 years after Brown, less than 1% of black children in the Deep South attended schools with white children.
Less than 1%. 10 years later.
Yep. So the courts couldn't enforce integration alone. The movement had to create intense public pressure to force Congress to act.
Which brings us to the textbook's Table 5.1. It explicitly maps out this cause and effect, which is so helpful.
It really is.
So cause, the 1960 sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. Effect, integration of Southern establishments.
Right.
Cause, 1961 freedom rides. Effect, the ICC orders desegregation on interstate buses.
You see the direct impact.
Exactly. And then the big one, cause, the 1963 March on Washington and the Birmingham protests. Effect, the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Which is a landmark piece of legislation. It didn't just end segregation in public spaces, it legally prohibited discrimination in employment and education.
And the legal landscape just keeps shifting after that. The text highlights the 1967 Supreme Court case, Loving v. Virginia.
A really important case.
Yeah, Richard Loving, who was white, and Mildred Loving, who was biracial, were literally banished from Virginia just for being married.
And the Supreme Court struck down that ban, declaring that marriage is a basic civil right.
So all of this provided a strategic blueprint.
It totally did. The Black civil rights movement showed other disadvantaged groups exactly how to demand their 14th Amendment protection.
Like the women's rights movement. The text talks about this historical doctrine called coverture, where husbands legally controlled all of a wife's property.
Right. Women were treated basically as second-class citizens legally.
But using this blueprint, they organized, secured the 19th Amendment for voting, and eventually got workplace protections under Title VII of that same 1964 Civil Rights Act.
And the contemporary LGBTQ plus movement used the exact same blueprint.
Right. The text has this great photo of the Stonewall 25 march. You have this huge crowd waving flags right in front of the Supreme Court, holding a banner affirming human rights.
It tracks perfectly. The outside spark was the 1969 Stonewall Uprising.
Right.
Then the inside strategy hits the courts. In 1996, you get Romer v. Evans, which struck down a Colorado law preventing gay rights ordinances.
And then it culminates in the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges decision.
Exactly, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. And here is a brilliant connection the textbook makes. The LGBTQ plus movement explicitly used the 1967 Loving v. Virginia interracial marriage ruling as their legal precedent.
Wow. They built directly on the previous movement.
Exactly.
Okay, so that brings us to civil rights today. And just a quick neutral disclaimer for you listening. When we discuss modern politically charged issues like affirmative action or Black Lives Matter, we are strictly reporting the textbook's factual analysis here.
Right. We're not taking any political sides, just breaking down the source material.
Exactly. So affirmative action, the text defines it as policies designed to compensate for past discrimination. And it tracks the Supreme Court timeline.
It's been a long back and forth.
Yeah. So in 1978, Regents of the Unifique of California v. Back, the court says diversity is a compelling interest, but strict racial quotas violate the 14th Amendment.
Right, no hard quotas.
Then in 2003, a Michigan law school case says a holistic, individualized review involving race is okay.
But then in 2023, everything changes with Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard.
Court totally overturned Bank.
They did. And the text contrasts the opinions here perfectly. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, arguing that students must be treated as individuals, not based on race.
Okay.
But Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent argued that the ruling actually entrenches racial inequality by ignoring systemic issues.
So the debate over what equal protection means is still very much alive.
Very much so.
And the text also covers the modern racial justice movement. It introduces Black Lives Matter, noting how it started as just a hashtag in 2013.
And then exploded into global activism after the 2020 killing of George Floyd.
There's a really stark black and white photo in the book of nighttime protesters. They're wearing face masks and holding a Black Lives Matter sign.
And the textbook assesses BLM's legacy by showing how it transformed the public conversation about race.
Right, pushing the nation to confront the need for a multiracial democracy.
And importantly, the text notes how intersectional it is, intertwining Black rights with transgender rights, native land returns, and fighting anti-Asian racism.
So to wrap this all up, we've seen the definition of equal protection completely transform in this chapter.
From Plessy v. Ferguson being the law of the land, all the way to today.
Right. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Based on exactly how we've seen these social movements operate, how they change the rules, what is something we accept as completely normal today that a future social movement might successfully redefine as a civil rights violation 50 years from now?
Ooh, that is a great question to think about.
It really makes you look at the present differently. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for listening.